Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly Podcast. Today I'm joined again by Keith Preston to discuss the limits of violence in the modern age and to achieve political objectives. So to start off, in the 18th century, von Humboldt wrote a book called The Limitations of State Power. And I think in this post-war scenario, after World War II, after 1945, we've seen an increasing ineffectiveness at violence being used to gain political objectives. So, for example, if you were the Roman Empire or the British Empire, you could be at war for decades and get everything you wanted, conquer all the territory, get all the resources, get all the slaves and subjects you wanted. And it paid to do it, which is why the British and Roman empires expanded the way they did. But increasingly, it's not effective at getting political objectives. So, right, as Clausewitz says, war is politics by other means. So presumably war, if it's to have a purpose, is to achieve some political end. And people resort to conflict to get some political end. And if we look at states in Korea, in Vietnam, in the first Gulf War, and the War on Terror, the United States has applied lots of military force. Korea was a truce, a tie. It was an armistice. And for the first time, we had to treat with another nation as an equal that was not defeated. And this was a nation that had previously been humiliated by European powers for 150 years. So this is pretty incredible that China pulled that off. Vietnam was, as we know, was a defeat for the United States. The first Gulf War was a success in part because of its limited objectives. Second of all, we have the War on Terror, which has pretty much been a disaster. Trillions of dollars spent, hundreds of thousands of people killed, and for really no tangible objectives, because the objectives we were told were to bring democracy to Iraq and Afghanistan and to bring democracy to the Middle East. And instead we got ISIS and civil wars. So we see that these political objectives of, uniting the Korean Peninsula, keeping South Vietnam free, bringing democracy to the Middle East has been very ineffective for the United States. Israel's had the same problem with Lebanon. They fought Lebanon, Hezbollah twice in the 80s, from 82 to I think to 86, and then in 2000, 2007. In each case, they had to withdraw due to international pressure. We see that the Arab states have tried to destroy Israel 3 times, 47, 67, and 73, all of which failed. We also see that the Russians, when they invaded Chechnya, the first Chechen war was a disaster. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was a disaster. Unless we think that, this is just a state problem. It's also a problem for insurrectionist rebels. We still have FARC in Colombia. They've been fighting the Colombian government for 40 years. We still have the Maoist rebels in Nepal. We still have the Shining Path in Peru. We still have the PLO, Hezbollah, and Hamas in Palestine and Lebanon and Gaza. The Tamil Tigers, which are now gone, in Sri Lanka, all of which have failed to achieve their political objectives. And we see that there's an increasing inability to use violence to achieve one's desired political outcomes, whether it's revolutionary or military. And we should also consider those successful revolutionaries like China with Mao and Vietnam with Giap and Ho Chi Minh. Yeah, Vietnam won, but what did they win? They were at war for 40 years, from 1945 until 1980. And the country was a bombed out hellhole. I mean, they didn't win anything. So even if you do win an insurrection, what's the price? What's the cost? You could say the Mujahideen beat the Soviets, but then Afghanistan fell into a 10-year civil war before the U.S. invasion from like 92 to 2001. And I think the reasons for this can be divided into roughly 2 categories. The first category is due to technology. With the mutually assured destruction policy of the United States and the Soviet Union, and now the United States and Russia, there's a certain threshold at which no nation will apply military force beyond. Because if they do so, that'll provide an existential threat to the balance of power, which could lead to a nuclear holocaust. So no nation is going to go beyond a certain point anymore to apply military power. Second of all, we have increased urbanization, which leads to turning basically almost every area where cities are into mountains. Fighting in the city is almost as difficult as fighting in the mountains. And then thirdly, for technology, is communications. With the international 24-hour news system, it's almost impossible to commit a massive atrocity to break the back of a rebel group or a country you're invading and keep it hidden. And oftentimes that will lead to an outcry from the global community to cause them to invade you. Case in point being Serbia with Slobodan Milosevic and the treatment of minorities in Bosnia and in Kosovo. And then we have what we might call changes that happen within the people. So we have, on the one hand, increasing wealth. People who have a lot of money, a lot of assets, and life is comfortable are less likely to go into the jungles and fight for 20 years or join the Imperial Army to, die in some godforsaken desert. It's just not a really good deal for them at that point because life is good at the moment. Another thing is military objectives tend to be more abstract than they used to be. They tend to be ideological, fighting for democracy, fighting to end, totalitarianism, things that are not easy to quantify, which is, of course, why the first Gulf War was largely successful. It was not fought for these abstract principles, but a more grounded principle of liberating an occupied country. The other thing we have is ideology for the resistance. In the 19th century, when Africa was conquered by European powers, these tribes didn't work together. Oftentimes, some of these tribes were as well equipped as the British. The same in India. In fact, in India, they had a level of technology on par with the British, but they didn't work together. Now, ideology is open source. Anybody can just crack open an ISIS manual or communist manual and create their own Islamic State or People's Republic of whatever. And these people can now organize across vast distances to make it prohibitively expensive for an occupying force to take over. And lastly, we have the democracy or representative government. It's increasingly difficult for a leader to start a war that is likely to incur lots of international condemnation, or a war that continues to be unprofitable in the long run and ignore the will of the people in perpetuity. Even a dictator like Slobodan Milosevic, who was overthrown in a relatively peaceful coup by protests, if you ignore the will of the people too long, they can overthrow you. So I think a combination of these 7 factors is all working together to decrease the viability of violence to achieve political objectives. What are some of your thoughts on that, Keith?
Well, you've touched on quite a few points there, and I agree with just about everything that you said. I think that a couple of things you mentioned are really the key, and one is certainly the technology. In the ancient Roman Empire, they didn't have anything even remotely approaching the kinds of modern military technology. So if you went and gathered a mass army together and went out and started conquering territories, you could do that fairly easily without laying waste to the entire society. You were going to gain a lot of treasure and people to rule over if you could just simply overrun your opponents with larger armies and sharper spears and things like that. It's not as productive to do that if you're just going to be ruling over a bombed out territory that's just totally been destroyed. What's the point? Also, because of the nuclear technology, the nation states have the means of resistance to a much greater degree. That's why there hasn't been a major war since World War II. The invention of nuclear weapons essentially made that kind of total warfare, early 20th century total warfare, cost prohibitive. I think if there's ever a nuclear war in the future, it won't be started by the Americans or the Russians or the Chinese or even the North Koreans. I think it would probably be either the Pakistanis or the Indians or the Israelis of any of the powers that have nukes now. And I think the reason for that is the way people think. Westerners, as well as the kinds of regimes that you see in China and North Korea and Russia, where they generally have a fairly secular or relatively secular outlook, are not going to be motivated by the idea where you're going to go to paradise if you annihilate the enemy, so who cares? But you could see a Taliban type regime coming to power in Pakistan and getting control of their nuclear arsenal, or some kind of Hindu fundamentalist sect in India, or some kind of Jewish, ultra-sectarian, ultra-Zionist sect in Israel, and actually thinking, yeah, it's worth the cost to actually use nuclear weapons. But even a scenario like that, I think, is far-fetched. But so nuclear weapons have made war essentially cost prohibitive on a large scale, and even on a shorter scale, even guerrilla warfare is a lot more violent and dangerous than it would have been in past times. If you were fighting guerrilla warfare, say like the Native Americans did against the American English colonialists in North America in the 18th and 19th century, then you're basically fighting with, slingshots and swords and whatever firearms you can come up with and all that kind of stuff. Nowadays, even guerrilla armies have some pretty powerful weaponry in terms of firearms, and also makeshift explosives and bomb-making capacities and things like that. I mean, even a guy like Tim McVeigh, one guy, or maybe with some other cohorts, made a bomb out of fertilizer and blew up an entire building and took out hundreds of people. So even in guerrilla warfare, you can do that kind of stuff today. So warfare just tends to be more destructive and therefore more cost prohibitive. It's also hard to get away with because states are much more mobile and have much greater surveillance powers now than they once did. It's one thing when you're fighting a state that's armed with men on horses. It's another thing when they've got tanks and airplanes and fighter pilots and all of that kind of stuff, and in addition to satellite technology and drones and all the kind of stuff they have today. So it's a lot harder to resist states through military means. So the technology is certainly a big thing, but also just a change in the way people think. Some of that has to do with rising living standards. If you were a member of the Roman Imperial Army, you were in a situation kind of like what the members of the North Korean army are probably in today, in the sense that, yeah, you might be a de facto slave, but you're still a slave that's fed better and probably paid better. And while you're still alive, you live better than a lot of the civilian subjects do. So being a member of the Roman army was actually a privilege in many ways, a privileged position, just like it is in North Korea with their army first policies. And for that, and if it's the army that's feeding you and keeping you from starving to death, then perhaps you will develop a very loyal attitude towards the army. I know when what's commonly called the Nazi salute, but the Roman salute, where that salute originates from is that it was used in ancient Rome by the Roman military forces. And when they would march off into battle, they would have a war ceremony. And one of the things they would say is, for those about to die, we salute you. It was an honor to die in the service of the emperor or whatever. You don't really see that much thinking of that in modern times. You do sometimes. You see the Islamist martyrs, and there were kamikazes during World War II. But not that many people really take the idea of loyalty to king and fatherland or whatever to such an extreme degree that they really want to get killed for it. Like even American troops, when they go into battle, most of them want to stay alive. They're hoping that's their real objective, and that's probably true of most modern armies. So people's thinking has just changed about those kinds of things, I think in part due to improved living conditions. Also, with the advent of modern democracies and republics and things like that as forms of government, Che Guevara himself once said that there was never really a successful revolution in a society that had elections and things like that was considered legitimate. And so those kinds of things, whatever their limitations, have had the effect of allowing people to channel political frustration towards nonviolent political means or more institutionalized political means rather than, say, terrorism and armed struggle and things of that nature. Another issue too when it comes to the use of violence is that there's just a whole change in consciousness, I think, in modern times when it comes to violence as opposed to what you found in older societies. Steven Pinker has written about this, but he talks about how there's actually been a worldwide decline in violence because nowadays, for example, the majority of countries around the world have either abolished the death penalty or discontinued its use. In the ancient and medieval world, that would have been unthinkable. I mean, they had the death penalty for all kinds of stuff, insulting the king, or even in 19th century America for grand larceny and things like that, you could get the death penalty if you were a horse thief or whatever. So there's just been this change in the way people think. Not everybody, obviously, but change in the way people think in terms of the use of violence, even to punish criminals and stuff like that. It's just not as a part of people's consciousness as much, I think.
Yeah, but to sort of highlight the atomic weapons issue, in modern industrial warfare, in order to have great war between great states, like say World War I or World War II, or even if you want to go back to the Napoleonic Wars, you have to basically resort to total war, where you mobilize the entire population to destroy your opponent. Now, there's many steps that you can take from the negotiating table to total war, and with the advent of nuclear weapons, and of course the risk of losing a total war, as we saw with Germany and Russia in World War I, Germany in World War II, it's terrible. You don't want to lose a situation like that. So you can't escalate conflict to that level to defeat another great power, because if they have nukes or they have allies that have nukes, they'll use them against you, and then you both lose. And so really, there's a certain whole host of tactics and strategies that are just off the table that you can't use anymore, because their cost is associated with the retaliation of an atomic weapon, which is just too great for anybody to consider. And we had to keep this in mind, that even when you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets only had 300 nuclear warheads, and yet that was still enough. And we had something like 3,000, 10 times more. But that was enough for the U.S. to still be gravely fearful of Soviets putting those missiles in Cuba. So it just tells you how powerful these weapon systems are. And when it comes to breaking the back of insurgencies, there is an effective way of doing it, right? You pick up a population, you relocate it, you pursue scorched earth policies of destroying their foodstuffs. This is what the United States did against the Great Plains Indians. This is what was done in Africa by many European colonial powers. This is what was done by the Assyrians and by the Mongols. But again, those kinds of tactics, while not encouraging a nuclear retaliation, can't be hidden anymore. They lead to a humanitarian crisis. You'll have international media. There'll be embargoes. There'll be assets frozen. People might even invade you, as in the case of Slobodan Milosevic, or in the case of Saddam Hussein. And so, again, a whole host of tactics, which are effective at breaking the back of insurgents, are no longer practical, because unless you yourself have nuclear weapons and it's an internal affairs issue, like say China had a revolt in, say, the Turkish provinces out east, they might be able to do it there, but that's because it's already a part of China. If they invaded a country and then did it, like they invaded Nepal or they invaded, South Korea, that would be a lot harder. And so again, this level of technology has raised the opportunity cost of tactics. So really, when you go to war, you're fighting with both hands tied behind your back, or you're blindfolded, because you can't use all the cards in your hand. And that really does limit its effectiveness. And I think that really can't be understated.
Well, another issue is to what degree are members of the populations of modern societies willing to go along with aggressive warfare or prolonged warfare. One of the most interesting impacts of the war in Vietnam is that after that war was over, it pretty much it put a lot of constraints on the power of the American government to actually wage war. For one thing, it made the military draft virtually impossible from a political perspective. A second thing was it soured the public's taste for international warfare to such a degree that the American public today really won't accept war if it means any sacrifices on their own side. For example, even after September 11th and the war in Afghanistan, when that turned into a quagmire, people started turning against the war as soon as there were any actual casualties. Once the casualties got to be in the 2,000 range, which is nothing by world standards or historical standards, but once the casualties got to be about in the 2,000 range, people were like, "Oh wow, people actually get killed in war. Well, we can't have that." They were used to thinking of war as this video game or something like that. And the kinds of things that populations were called on to do in past times would never be accepted today on a public level. For instance, I know elderly people who lived through World War II, and they talk about, you were expected to pitch in. They rationed meats and foods and metals, and you're supposed to turn in your scrap metal to support the war effort. And we had blackouts, in case there was ever a bombing raid overhead. And most people today would just refuse to be bothered with that. I mean, like, no, I'm going to do what I want to do, and enough people would feel that way that any kind of special requirements like that were posed on the public probably just wouldn't work if there's non-compliance and lack of interest. So this whole idea that people are willing to rally behind their respective national state and fight for the fatherland or whatever is really just something that's gotten out of vogue in a lot of countries, particularly the developed countries, and even in a lot of other places. People just don't have loyalties to their respective political leaders or state or nation or anything the way that they might have. In fact, those kinds of loyalties are being transferred to other kinds of organizations and institutions. Fourth generation warfare theorists have written about this. They talk about how people are now becoming less loyal to particular nations or states and more loyal to their individual causes or reference groups. I mean, it could be anything from a street gang to a terrorist group to a cult or something less extreme than that. But that's what people are into now. That's where their loyalties lie. I mean, we see that even in the United States. With liberals, their loyalty is to the Democratic Party and to the blue tribe, not to America as some abstract idea. And the same thing is true with the red tribes. And of course, the groups on the margins are even more extreme in that direction. So the whole idea of national patriotism and fighting for your country and all of that kind of stuff really just isn't fashionable anymore. And people just don't buy into that way of thinking.
Yeah, there's another element that I forgot to mention that also leads to that also contributes to this fact is if you look at civil wars in the past, say 60 years, they tend to be very inconclusive and they tend to last a very long time. So like the Lebanese civil war lasted 15 years. It only really ended with Syrian occupation, where the Syrian army just occupied the region to bring peace. You could argue that what the Soviets started in 78, 79, when they assassinated the leader of the Republic of Afghanistan, led to essentially an ongoing civil war where various factions brought in foreign powers to fight for them to achieve domination at home. And they've been at war for over 40 years now. And part of this is because foreign powers are much more willing to send supplies, experts, and depending on the situation, limited expeditionary forces. So they keep stirring the pot, right? So, for example, in Angola, in 1975, they won independence from Portugal, but they ended up fighting UNITA in the southeast of the country for the next 40 years until 2010, and that was because the Chinese and the United States were constantly sending supplies and aid to Savimbi. And so we see that if we have, because of foreign powers, either great powers or regional neighbors who want this or that faction to win, they keep stirring the pot up. And the only way to cut off the supplies of one revolutionary group would be to attack its supplier, which might be prohibitively expensive. And that's another factor that leads to the ongoing inconclusiveness of violence. Well,
I think that the point you raise about war being a lot more prolonged and with less decisive victories is an important issue, because it also feeds into what I was talking about earlier about why people are less enthusiastic about war than they might have been at one point. One question I've heard asked by some historians is why was there no protest movement against the Korean War like there was for the war in Vietnam? Because they were both very similar wars. And what was the difference? They were only about 15 years apart. And yet the public reaction, the public barely noticed the Korean War as opposed to the Vietnam War. What was the difference? And I think the difference, that there was a number of differences in terms of cultural and generational changes that happened between the early 50s and the late 60s. But I think it's also true that the World War II and the Korean War were wars that, by historical standards, really didn't last very long. World War II was a massive event in terms of the number of people killed, and it was the biggest war in history. It was really the biggest event in history, period. But American involvement in that war only lasted from December of 1941 to August of 1945. So that's only about 3.5 years that the United States was actually involved in that war. I mean, that's as much time as between now. Excuse me. That's as much time as between now and the latter part of 2015. I mean, that was just a short time ago. So people were used to going to war, you fight, you win, your side wins. I mean, the United States was only involved in World War I for how long? About a year. I mean, there were large-scale casualties, but it was still a decisive victory for the American side. And then World War II, same thing, a large number of casualties, but the war only lasted 3.5 years, and another decisive victory for the American side. Korean War only lasted about 3 years. It paled in comparison to the two world wars, and it was a less decisive victory, but it was still within that mode. But the opposition to the war in Vietnam really didn't start to escalate until the war had already been going on for several years. I mean, America had been involved in Vietnam for 3 or 4 years before the opposition to the war in Vietnam really started to escalate. The United States started actually directly engaging in Vietnam in 1965. It was in 1967 that you first started to have larger protests against the war. It wasn't until about 1968 or 69 when the anti-war movement was really starting to spiral, as well as the war in Vietnam itself has started to spiral. But with these previous wars, the war would have been over within that frame of time. World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, they would have been over by the time the United States had been involved for, say, 4 years, whereas the U.S. was just getting started in Vietnam after 4 years. Like you were saying, you have these prolonged wars that people see no decisive victory in. That was a big thing with Vietnam. People say, well, how long is this going to last? How's it going to turn out? Are we going to win? It doesn't look like it. And of course, you had people that said, well, we can win. We got to still stick with it. Other people say, no, it's lost. Or, then on the further end, people say, well, maybe we shouldn't win. That was a political question. But the fact that modern war tends to be prolonged and indecisive tends to make it a lot more unpopular. Afghanistan is a classic example. It's only been a mere 18 years or whatever, and it's still going on, and it's basically where it was when it started.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the contributing factors to this is both for the reasons for people in developed countries to not want to risk their life and limb to go to war, and why people who are being occupied in LDCs are more likely to resist, is the ideology of freedom. The Enlightenment brought to us with the French Revolution, and even before that with the ideas of Locke and Hobbes and others, the idea of liberty and freedom. Now, whether you view that in a racial context, a democratic context, or a socialist context, that's like your God. You're going to fight for that with your last dying breath. It's like that statement from the American gun rights group. It says, you can pry the gun from my cold dead hands. And so if you've already got freedom, or at least you perceive that you have freedom, you don't necessarily want to go and die, because then you'll lose it. And if you perceive that you're losing your freedom, then you'll fight to the death to keep it. And so it creates this interesting dynamic where those that are rich and powerful who think that they have freedom are less likely to go die because they don't want to lose it. And those who are poor, if they get occupied, like in Vietnam or Afghanistan or elsewhere, are more willing to continue the fight because they don't want to lose it. And I think that ideological component is an important component in why this is the case.
Well, I think you had that in pre-modern societies. I think you had people that were much more willing to fight for church and king and things like that. Certainly we have elements of that today with the Islamists. I mean, I think they have that kind of pre-enlightenment, pre-modern type of outlook. And there are some other examples of that, of people who view themselves as fighting for, kith and kin or blood and soil or something like that around the world. A lot of anti-colonial movements, that's really what they were. But yeah, I mean, people in developed societies aren't willing to assume the risks that are associated with war. They're used to a life of relative comfort and luxury. You don't want to put aside the cell phone and computer and video screen and video games to go off and get killed. I mean, maybe some people do, but that's not really the norm. Even today, military recruiters, they don't really sell recruitment on things like, give your life for the state, and that's not how they sell it. I mean, they talk about the benefits you can get, well, if you do your time in the service, you can get your college education later on, or you get, free health care, or, it's all about selling benefits. I knew a kid one time that some military recruiters were trying to bring him in, and they were telling him they could help him with his career as a rapper or something like that. So that, today they sell military service as a job opportunity, not as, you're going to die for the glory of the empire or something like that. So it's a whole, as I was saying earlier, it's a whole different change in the way people think, and it comes from having a relatively privileged, luxurious society by historical standards. I think one thing about developed countries, underdeveloped countries, though, that makes them more willing to fight is the fact that they see themselves as having the moral high ground. They do continue to view themselves as, hey, we're fighting for our religion or our nation or our people or our whatever they're fighting for. Whereas for the first world people, it's more about ideology. Even if you really believe, say in the Cold War, for example, you go fight in Vietnam or in Korea, you say, I'm here to fight communism. But you never saw any communists in your backyard. They weren't coming to your backyard and, stealing your chickens or something like that. It's all abstract. It's all, you view communism as this abstract menace, not something that's personally, immediately threatening. And so, once you get into an actual combat situation where, say, you're expected to give your life for this cause, you start to have second thoughts about that in many instances. And that was actually an issue in Vietnam. You had troops that just refused to fight. That was true in Iraq with Saddam Hussein. A lot of Saddam Hussein's troops just simply wouldn't put up the effort. And that's the Soviet Union, when that collapsed, the hardliners from the Communist Party and the KGB and the military tried to stage a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev, and they sent the army out to suppress the protests and all of that, and the army just wouldn't fight either. So you just have a way of thinking where people aren't willing to make sacrifices for any of these kinds of things. People in developed and underdeveloped countries who see themselves as genuinely oppressed, yes, but not people who feel like they have anything to lose.
Exactly. Related to this is the idea that, we don't appreciate this now, but even 200 years ago, people, having to deal with death that came close to home, friends, family, maybe even their own, disease, famine, plague, pestilence, all of these things were everyday occurrences for everybody. And everybody just sort of understood life was short. And in fact, that was part of the honor in battle itself. It's like, look, we all know we're going to die soon. You might as well go out in the blaze of glory rather than just, die by breaking your neck, falling into a pit, which has no honor in it at all. But, of course, now with modern medicine, we've been able to conquer many of these things. With industrial capitalism, we've been able to produce food far in excess of what we need to live. So now we don't have to worry about famine anymore. So a lot of these things that made death and the frailty of life made it come close to home isn't happening anymore. So people aren't necessarily confronted with that, and it does change their attitude. Another aspect is education. We live in a society where people are more broadly educated than ever before. So Soviet Union is a good example. So let's say anywhere from 1920 to 1956. It's really easy to get a bunch of illiterate, poorly educated peasants, give them a machine gun, and tell them to just machine gun a whole bunch of political prisoners or whatever, and they'll do it. They're not going to really think about it because they're peasants. They haven't been educated. Life is tough. If you give them food and a place to live, they'll be okay. But in 1991, where most Russian people had gotten a high school education, maybe gone to college, people who join the Russian army at that point are like, it's far less likely that they're going to go and shoot up a bunch of political dissidents if they've been educated. Because one of the things is, and I think it was 1973, Curtis LeMay, when he was talking about his hand in the bombing of Japan, he's like, look, war is killing people. It's a terrible thing. It's if I'd have been lost the war, I'd been tried as a war criminal. But a good soldier doesn't ask why he's doing what he's doing. He just does it. So people that are not educated or low IQ, yeah, it's really easy for them to do that. But, IQs have risen due to better nourishment. People, are able to consume the calories they need to survive. So then they're able to grow to full maturity, which means they'll have higher IQs than their ancestors. So people with higher IQs and better education are more likely to think about, why am I doing this? Like, should I really be doing this order? And if enough soldiers do that, then, as we saw in 1991, the counter-revolution wins.
Yeah, well, that, again, back to what I was saying earlier about Vietnam, I think that was a crucial issue there, because in the immediate period after World War II, in the 50s and 60s, you had more and more people going to college than ever before. You had more and more people graduating from high school than ever before. So you did have a much more educated population than what would have been the case just a generation or two earlier. Also, you had people becoming more aware of what was going on in the world because of television and the growth of media. The war in Vietnam was actually televised. In fact, I was a child in the Vietnam War, so I remember seeing it on TV, actual combat footage, just on the news, just like a football game or something. You have actual war reporters there with the cameras. There's people shooting each other. In fact, that's one of the reasons why the Pentagon doesn't allow journalists behind enemy lines nowadays, is because that was one of the things that turned public opinion against the war. People saw that and like, what? That's how it works. So people learned, I think, where the means of information were much more developed. People had become more educated, and also for the first time ever in post-war America and Western Europe and some other places, you had post-scarcity societies. That is, where people were not just struggling for bread and butter. In the pre-World War II era in America, and America was the richest country in the world at that point, even at that point. But in pre-World War II America, you still had people that starved to death during the Great Depression. You had people that literally, struggled for food and shelter and just very basic things. After World War II, during the economic boom of the post-war period, for the first time ever, you had a working class that could join the middle class and even live like an upper middle class, which was historically unprecedented. So all of a sudden, you had this whole generation of people that were more highly educated, better fed, and had higher living standards, and were more informed about world defense. And then all of a sudden, you're going to take these 18-year-olds that have grown up in that situation in 1968 and put a gun in their hands and send them off to a rice paddy and say, okay, go shoot these Viet Cong people, right? And they're like, for what? What did they ever do to me? That was a different way of a whole different way of looking at it. Like after what happened after September 11th is a good example, as opposed to what happened at Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor and September 11th were roughly equivalent in terms of the number of people that got killed. It was both cases. It was an air attack on the United States, and a few thousand people died. After after Pearl Harbor, you had Americans that went out and stood in line to join the services to go fight the Japanese. It was the thing to do. Everybody was like 100% gung-ho. When September 11th came, there were people that thought like that. It maybe lasted a day or two, and then everybody's like, I don't know about this. Yeah, and by the time the actual war in Afghanistan started, war fever had already declined. And then by the time that the war had lasted for about a year or so, people were really like, well, I don't know about this. Maybe this isn't a good idea. Then when the Iraq War came, easily half the population was opposed to it. And then public opinion on that went sour very briefly after just a few months. So it's just a fact that you can't really, I would say people just can't get duped by that kind of thing as much as they once did. Not when they have higher levels of education, information, higher living standards, and things like that.
Yeah, actually, your thing about information is absolutely correct. There's been lots of revisionist material on conflicts in the post-war era, much, but not all of it coming from the far left. Some of it also comes from libertarians. At the time, there was lots of revisionist literature about World War I in the 20s and 30s and World War II in the late 40s, early 50s. A lot of that has been forgotten, but we forget that the revisionist literature in World War I made it very difficult for the United States to enter World War II. Many Americans were like, we're not going to get duped again, which is in part why Roosevelt had to provoke Japan to actually attack us, because he knew that unless we were directly attacked, the American people were not interested. And now that we couple this with, instant communications with the internet and higher education, and the ease of access to getting information, it is going to be very difficult to dupe people in order to get them to go off and fight in some other country. And then for the same reason, nation states are less likely to use a sort of war of attrition strategy, because every body bag that goes back home lowers morale at home. And so the more people that die in a sort of meat grinder scenario, like with, World War I or even World War II or Korea, people just won't put up with that anymore. And so it's like, furthermore, because you signed up for a career as a volunteer, you don't expect that you're going to get thrown into the worst possible situation to get blown to bits. And if you knew that, you'd probably mutiny,
Yeah, well, it's interesting how the United States, although the United States is technically the greatest military power in world history at this point, it's interesting how the United States has been relegated to having to fight wars largely through indirect means. Like, they haven't had the draft for 45 years. They and even public opinion has soured on the use of regular army, just professional military as well, if there's any casualties or anything like that involved. So increasingly, war is being fought with through proxy armies, through mercenaries, through technology, through the use of foreign states. Like, one of the things that Trump wants to do with Syria, the war in Syria, is he's trying to farm it out to the Turks. He wants the Americans to pull back and let the Turks pick up the slack. And then in Afghanistan, Trump has talked about using mercenaries, these Blackwater type companies or whatever they're called now. And more, I think we'll see war being fought that way in the future. I think generally the public at large will be so opposed to or indifferent to fighting for their country or whatever, that elites, when they get into warfare, that's what they'll do. They'll use the armies of third world nations and mercenaries and terrorists and technology and all of these kinds of things, and rely less on, certainly rely less on conscripts, but even rely less on professional army. That'll be more of a proxy type of warfare that's being used. That's really how the United States today does it. I mean, if you look at every war that's happened in more recent years, there was always a significant emphasis on technological warfare. There was always the use of proxy forces. There was also always the use of foreign states that the war could be farmed out to. I mean, even in Afghanistan with the Northern Alliance and groups like that. So that seems to be the model now. You find the poorest, most backward people in the world, and then recruit them as your proxy army.
Yeah, exactly. And part of the purpose of this is we see a lot in the political discourse on the right and the left. Call to civil war. Whether that'll amount to anything is yet to be seen. But the reason why people make these calls is because they think violence is a shortcut. They think that we've got political gridlock, we're not getting what we want. So if we just take up the gun, it'll be a shortcut. We'll just leapfrog to victory. But the point is, if that were to happen, it would be an unmitigated disaster for the United States, and it would not end quickly. I think at a minimum it would last 10 years. And I guarantee you, every foreign power that we screwed over is going to be sending in advisors, materials, and maybe even special forces to help various rebel groups fight the central government. And if that's the case, then we could have an Afghanistan situation which lasts 40 years. And it would be a complete disaster for everybody because, of course, the global economy would collapse and stuff like that. So the call for a civil war is really kind of insane.
Yeah. A situation in the United States, like a Turner Diaries situation or something like that, wouldn't have a happy ending. What you would see, I think you're right in the sense that if there was a total breakdown of civil society in the United States, you would probably see not a two-faction civil war between the red and blue tribe. You would see a 100-faction civil war between virtually all kinds of people. I mean, every street gang would see an opportunity to settle scores with rivals, and every mafia faction, and every outlaw motorcycle club, and every rival drug cartel, and that's before we even get into the rival cultural groups and ethnic groups and all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, you would just see an orgy of bloodshed, basically. And I think foreign forces would certainly get involved in it. The Chinese and the Russians and everyone else would see the opportunity to extend their reach and pick their own proxy forces. Well, okay, Chinese will say, okay, we're going to back the Antifa, and the Russians will say we're going to outback the alt-right or whatever. And it wouldn't be a pretty situation. Yeah, so that's definitely something you want to avoid. I think we agree on that.
Yeah, because again, violence isn't really a shortcut. At least not what it used to be. And even if we want to go to the before 1945, with the advent of industrialization, war became increasingly expensive and costly. So let's look at World War I. Okay, the Allies, they won. Now the United States came in late and didn't really suffer that many casualties. But yeah, the French won, but it pretty much destroyed the French nation. France has never really recovered from the trauma of the trenches. And England, while it was able to carry on in World War II, it was a shadow of its former self. I mean, if you look at the European theater in World War II, I don't think the English, with the possible exception of the North Africa campaign, won a single campaign without U.S. aid. Whereas in World War I, they were more than capable of independent military operations against the Germans and the Turks. And so even though they won, they lost a lot. And then, of course, the English win World War II, but then they lose their entire empire. So with industrialization, we're not even talking about TV or nukes. The winners still win, but then what do they win? You know what I mean? Because they end up losing everything, it seems, So we even begin to see this trend beginning with industrialization.
Yeah, well, industrialization, I think, contributed to making war cost prohibitive, because it's really what allowed total warfare to take place. To have a war that's organized as a modern industry, and then have the modern industry that's necessary to produce modern military technology, produces a situation where there's not going to be a positive outcome to any war for anyone. It's like, of all the contending parties to World War II that came out on top, you could argue the United States came out on top because after World War II, the United States controlled half the world's economy and was a superpower and all of that, and the war hadn't actually been fought on American soil, so you didn't have the internal devastation you saw everywhere else. But other than that, I mean, who won in World War II? I mean, I guess Joseph Stalin won because he got to expand his empire into Eastern Europe and all of that, and then in Asia, Mao won and Ho Chi Minh won, because that was the impetus, that the defeat of Imperial Japan was the impetus that allowed the Mao and Kim and Ho Chi Minh and others to come to power eventually. So I guess Asian communism won, which is basically just the Eastern world's version of fascism or National Socialism. So yeah, what's the point? I mean, I guess is the issue. What's the point? And other wars too. I mean, look at the Spanish Civil War. I mean, that turned out terribly. And the Afghan war has been going on for 45 years now in different forms, and and that country was it's interesting to go back and actually look at pictures of Afghanistan from the 60s. They were almost westernized, almost modernized at that point. Nowadays when we think of Afghanistan, we think of these really primitive people that live in the mountains and all that kind of stuff, and dressed like they did in the Middle Ages. But you can find pictures of Afghanistan from the 60s where Afghanistan looks like you would think you were looking at a Western country or something like that. Their whole society's just been totally destroyed. So yeah, nothing really good comes out of any of this.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're about out of time. So is there anything you'd like to leave us with before we wrap this up?
Yeah, when it comes to the question of how you go about affecting political change in modern societies, I think that we've switched to a different model, where it's not just about carrying out coups and revolutions through armed struggle and stuff like that, like the American Revolution or the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution and the Civil War or any of that kind of stuff. I think it's more about change in society or in politics or in government happens through popular resistance on a less grandiose level. I mean, a less violent level. A good example is all the stuff that happened in the 60s, like the Civil Rights Movement and the Anti-Vietnam War movement. Those movements were both very successful. They totally flipped the script on a lot of things. and their legacy has certainly been very enduring. So I'd argue those were very successful movements, but they didn't really do it through terrorism and that kind of stuff. And that kind of, armed struggle and all that was very much on the margins in those movements. It was more just a question of popular resistance. It was a combination of civil disobedience and mass protest, or just non-cooperation, or changing people's opinions. People's opinions started to change about some of the issues that were being addressed over time. And that in turn reshaped political factors. Then Nixon, for example, ended the draft because he wanted to take the winds out of the sails of the anti-war movement. And then you had Democrats that were elected to Congress in 1973 and 74 that wanted to ride the wave of the anti-Vietnam War movement to political power, and they ended funding for the Vietnam War. And the same thing is true in the 60s with civil rights. I mean, who was it that signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into legislation? It was Lyndon Johnson, a Texan, a Southern Texan. I mean, like he would have given a damn about civil rights if it wasn't something that was politically in vogue at the time. So that's really the case there. I think that it's only when popular resistance begins on the ground level that the politics starts to change. But terrorism and violence and armed struggle and all that really isn't the way you do it in a modern society. It's that's more of a thing of the past.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on, Keith. It's always a pleasure. This is Silas of the President Folly Podcast, signing off.